Imagine you are standing in a corridor, cut into solid rock 3,000 years ago. Your torch is the only light for 100 meters in either direction. And the people who carved this tunnel did not believe the dark ahead of you was empty. Some of these creatures were painted only in the deepest, most restricted chambers of tombs, where even the tomb's own owner was never meant to see them again after burial. They believed something was waiting in it, something with a name, something that could be summoned or held at bay simply by knowing what to call it. Ancient Egypt is remembered for gold, for pyramids, for pharaohs carved in stone to look eternal. But underneath that polished image was a bestiary, a working catalogue of creatures so feared that some of them were never meant to be spoken about after dark. And at least one of them was considered so dangerous that priests tried to erase it from existence itself, not defeat it in a story, erase it physically, in ritual, over and over, forever. Tonight we are counting down 30 of them, 30 entities that Egyptians actually carved, painted, prayed to, or fought against in texts you can still read today. From the strange to the monstrous, to the one creature Egypt tried to make disappear, stay until the end. Because that last one isn't a myth about a monster. It's a myth about what a civilization does when it decides something is too dangerous to even be remembered by name. One quick note before we start, because it'll come up. You'll hear me use the familiar names throughout: Egypt, Anubis, because that's how most of the world knows this mythology. And it's how you'll find these creatures if you go looking for them yourself. But the people who actually believed in them didn't call their land Egypt. They called it Kemet, the Black Land, after the fertile soil the Nile left behind. And a name like Anubis is a Greek translation of the older name, Anpu. This same principle of translation applies to nearly every name in Egyptian mythology you've ever heard, whether you realized it or not. Worth keeping in the back of your mind, because it's a reminder that even the names we think we know have already passed through several thousand years of translation before reaching us. Right, let's start counting. 30. The Children of Apophis. The sun god's nightly crossing of the underworld wasn't a single confrontation. It was a running battle. Egyptian funerary texts describe smaller serpents, sometimes framed as Apophis's own brood, swarming the solar bark in waves before the main threat ever appeared. The crew of the boat, a roster of gods including Set himself, cast here as a defender rather than a villain, had to fight through these lesser attackers first. The boat itself carried two names, depending on the hour: Medjed by day and Mesektet by night. It's a detail that tells you something about how the Egyptians understood chaos, not as one dramatic clash, but as a threat that had to be fought back nightly in stages forever, because it never actually stopped trying. 29. The sacred crocodiles of Crocodilopolis. In the Fayum region, at a city the Greeks would later name Crocodilopolis, real living crocodiles were kept in temple pools, hand-fed by priests, adorned with gold rings and jeweled collars. These animals weren't mascots. They were treated as living vessels for the crocodile god Sobek. And when one died, it was mummified with the same care given to royalty, wrapped, preserved, and buried in dedicated crocodile necropolises that archaeologists have since excavated by the thousands. At another cult site, Kom Ombo, temple reliefs show priests presenting offerings directly to the crocodile god, twinned there with Horus, in one of the few temples in Egypt dedicated to two gods at once. The line between animal and monster in Kemet was thinner than we tend to assume, and this is one of the clearest physical proofs of it. 28. The Fish-Headed Gatekeepers. The underworld wasn't a single space you simply walked into. It was structured. divided by a sequence of gates, mounds, and caverns, each one guarded. This structure is described in detail in a specific funerary text known as the Book of Gates, one of several guides meant to help the deceased navigate the underworld safely. Some funerary texts describe entities with fish heads stationed at these thresholds, armed and watchful, and the deceased was expected to know their names and the correct address to speak in order to pass. Get the words wrong, and the gate simply didn't open for you. 27. The souls of Nekhen and Pi. Long before the unification of Egypt, the towns of Nekhen and Pi were separate seats of power in the south and north. Their divine ancestors were later folded into official religion as the souls of Nekhen and the souls of Pi, spirits depicted with falcon and jackal heads, predating most of the gods people recognize today. Egyptologists sometimes call this pairing the souls of the two lands, a phrase that captures how deeply Egypt's earliest political geography was baked into its religious imagination, and invoked specifically at coronations as a link back to a version of Egypt older than the pharaohs themselves. 26. Qetesh and Her Lions. Not every entity in the Egyptian bestiary was originally Egyptian. Qetesh was a war and fertility goddess, imported from the Near East during the New Kingdom, absorbed into Egyptian religious art, typically shown standing barefoot on the back of an untamed lion. She's often shown holding lotus blossoms and serpents in each hand, a visual blending of Egyptian floral symbolism with clearly foreign iconography. Her presence is proof that Kemet's bestiary wasn't a sealed system. It actively imported and repurposed foreign entities when it suited the culture's needs. 25. Shai. In Kemet, your death wasn't an open question waiting to be decided later. Shai, the personification of fate, was sometimes depicted as a serpent-like presence, appearing at the exact moment of a person's birth, because your allotted lifespan in this worldview was already fixed before you drew your first breath. Some linguists trace an echo of this word into Coptic, the descendant of the ancient Egyptian language. Shai appears repeatedly in the Book of the Dead as a figure the deceased must answer to, a kind of cosmic accountant, checking whether your life matched what had already been written for you. 24. Bes. He is short. He is deliberately ugly. He sticks out his tongue, bulges his eyes, and pulls faces like a gargoyle mid-tantrum. And that is precisely the point. Bes wasn't a monster to be feared. He was a monster designed to be worse looking than whatever might be coming for you. Unlike almost every other deity in the pantheon, Bes was typically shown facing the viewer directly, rather than in the traditional Egyptian side profile, another deliberate break from convention, designed to make him feel more immediate. Statues and amulets of Bes have been found in household bedrooms across Egypt for over 2,000 years, placed specifically near where women gave birth and where children slept, because Bes's entire mythological job was to be loud, grotesque, and terrifying enough to scare off anything more dangerous than himself. It's one of the few instances in this entire bestiary where the monster and the protector are the exact same figure. 23. Taweret. Picture a hippopotamus standing upright on two legs, heavily pregnant, with the paws of a lion and the tail of a crocodile, an anatomical impossibility, and one of the most physically bizarre deities anywhere in the ancient world. Taweret appears constantly in birthing scenes, on protective amulets, and on the ceremonial wands used in household rituals to ward off harm during labor, a moment the Egyptians understood to be genuinely dangerous. Archaeologists have traced her image, influencing art well beyond Egypt too. The so-called Minoan genius a hybrid creature that appears in Bronze Age Aegean art from roughly 1800 BCE, is widely believed to have derived directly from Taweret's form. Her fearsome, hybrid form wasn't a design flaw, it was armor. 22. The Serpopard. Long, serpentine necks growing directly out of leopard bodies, frequently carved in symmetrical pairs facing one another. Most famously on the Nama palette, one of the oldest surviving pieces of Egyptian art dated to around 3100 BCE. Similar long-necked hybrid creatures appear in Mesopotamian art from roughly the same era, suggesting some degree of visual exchange between the two civilizations long before formal trade routes are documented. Egyptologists still debate exactly what the intertwined serpopard necks were meant to symbolize. Possibly the binding together of two halves of a newly unified Egypt. But the image's power is undeniable, simply from how long it persisted in Egyptian visual language. 21. Bennu, a heron-like solar bird, associated with creation, rebirth, and the annual flooding of the Nile that made Egyptian agriculture possible at all. Some New Kingdom texts associate the Bennu bird with the planet Venus, linking its cycles of appearance and disappearance to the bird's own myth of death and renewal. Later Greek writers absorbed elements of Bennu into their own myth of the phoenix, a bird that dies in flame and is reborn from its own ashes, making this one of the more direct lines connecting Egyptian mythology to the folklore most people already know. 20. Medjed. You may already know this one without knowing its name. Medjed appears exactly once in the surviving corpus of Egyptian funerary texts, in a papyrus copy of the Book of the Dead, described only as a cone-shaped, faceless entity capable of striking enemies with light from its eyes. Its name translates to something like the smiter, or he who strikes, fitting for a being whose entire described power is a blow of light. And that's essentially all the ancient sources tell us. For 3,000 years, it sat as a genuine footnote, unremarked upon. Then, in the last decade, Japanese fans of Egyptology rediscovered the description, found the visual so strange and oddly charming that it became an internet mascot, and an obscure funerary spirit that almost no scholar had ever written a paper about got a second life. Nobody in ancient Thebes could have predicted. 19. The Guardian Panthers. Feline entities depicted flanking sacred and royal boundaries in temple and tomb art. Similar feline guardians appear carved onto ceremonial furniture and thrones recovered from royal tombs, including pieces found in Tutankhamun's burial chamber. Not decorative filler, but symbolic sentries marking the line between protected ground and everything outside it. 18. Aker, a double lion god, shown as two lions seated back to back, one facing the horizon of sunrise, the other the horizon of sunset. Between them sits the gate the sun itself was believed to pass through twice daily on its journey through the underworld and back into the sky. Some later funerary texts describe Aker not as two separate lions, but as a single being with two heads, blurring the line between duality and unity in a way that reflects broader Egyptian ideas about balance. Aker isn't just a guardian figure, he's effectively a piece of cosmic architecture, the literal threshold of day and night. 17. The beast of Set, the Shai. This is the one that should genuinely unsettle you, because unlike almost everything else on this list, it isn't a mythological invention layered onto a real animal. It's an animal that has never been identified. Straight, squared-off ears, a stiffly forked tail unlike any Nile Valley creature, a long, downturned snout that matches nothing in the region's actual fauna, not the jackal, not the aardvark, not the greyhound, though scholars have proposed all three over the past century without consensus. Because the animal itself remains unidentified, some Egyptologists have proposed it may represent a now extinct species or simply a deliberately composite, imaginary creature built specifically to feel wrong. This composite, unidentifiable creature became the sacred animal of Set, god of storms, chaos, and the desert, and the genuine uncertainty over what it even was may be exactly why it fit a god associated with disorder so well. 16. The ram-headed sphinx, the Criosphinx. Rows of these once lined the processional avenue at Karnak Temple, each carved with a lion's body and a ram's head, the ram being sacred to Ammon, king of the gods during the New Kingdom. A smaller number of ram-headed sphinxes also guarded the approach to temples at Soleb, in what is now Sudan, showing how far this particular guardian image traveled beyond Egypt's traditional borders. Walking that avenue meant walking a physical gauntlet of divine protection. Dozens of stone guardians deep. 15. The falcon-headed sphinx, the Hieracosphinx, a lion's body carrying the head of a falcon instead of a human face, a less famous variant than the Great Sphinx at Giza. Falcon imagery in general was tightly bound to kingship in Egypt, since the god Horus himself was typically shown as a falcon or a falcon-headed man, making this hybrid a doubly royal guardian. But part of the same broad tradition of fusing royal or divine power with the raw physical strength of a lion. 14. The Classic Sphinx, lion's body, human head, and in Egyptian tradition, nothing whatsoever to do with riddles. That association came centuries later from the Greeks. The word sphinx itself is Greek, not Egyptian. The Egyptians more commonly referred to these guardian statues using a term meaning living image, reflecting their role as active protectors rather than passive artwork. Layered onto a symbol that in Kemet stood for something more direct. The pharaoh's own power fused with a lion's ferocity, carved at monumental scale to guard sacred approaches. 13. Khepri, imagined at colossal, cosmic scale as a scarab beetle rolling the sun itself across the sky each morning. A direct visual borrowing from something any Egyptian could observe firsthand. A dung beetle rolling its ball of dung across the ground. The name Khepri is itself built from the Egyptian verb meaning to come into being, making the god's very name a description of his function. It's a genuinely strange image, once you actually sit with it. The birth of a new day, imagined as an insect's daily labor projected onto the heavens. 12. Nehebkau, a primordial coiling serpent, described in some of the very earliest pyramid texts as predating most of the pantheon that came after it. Nehebkau is linked to the binding of a person's ka, their life force, to their physical body. In some funerary spells, Nehebkau is invoked specifically to guarantee that a person would be able to eat and breathe in the afterlife, tying this ancient serpent to something as basic as continued survival beyond death. And without that binding, in some versions of the mythology, the soul simply couldn't remain attached to a person at all. 11. Denwan. This one almost changed everything. A primordial fire serpent, described in the pyramid texts as having grown powerful enough to threaten the assembled gods, with total destruction by flame. Some translations connect Denwan's name to a root associated with the color red, or fire, reinforcing the serpent's fiery nature, even at a linguistic level. An apocalypse, the myth says, was only narrowly averted, though the surviving texts are frustratingly brief. about exactly how. It's one of the oldest recorded near-miss extinction myths in Egyptian religion, tucked into funerary spells meant to protect a king's soul, of all places. 10. Renenutet, a cobra goddess of the harvest, gentle and nurturing in most surviving depictions. She was invoked at harvest time and credited with the naming and protection of newborns. She was also closely associated with the cobra-shaped uraeus worn on the pharaoh's crown, linking the same protective, fire-breathing imagery directly to royal authority. But temple texts also describe her breathing fire against anyone who threatened the fields under her protection, making her one of several deities in this bestiary who occupy both the protector and the monster role, depending entirely on whether you were friend or threat. 9. Nekhen, a giant coiled serpent whose entire mythological function was protective, wrapping itself around the sun god's bark each night, forming a living shield against the chaos waiting in the underworld's darkness. Nekhen even lends his name to an actual ancient Egyptian board game, a spiral track shaped like his coiled body. Versions of the Nekhen board game have been found in tombs dating back over 5,000 years, making it one of the oldest complete game systems ever recovered from an ancient civilization. 8. Dedun, an ancient deity associated with Egypt's southern frontier region, tied to incense roots and to the wild, fierce animals of the arid borderlands beyond the Nile Valley proper. Some scholars associate Dedun with panther or leopard imagery, linking this frontier deity to the same feline guardian tradition seen elsewhere on this list. A reminder that Egyptian mythology extended well past the river itself, into territory the Egyptians considered genuinely untamed. 7. The monstrous Sobek-Ra, not the gilded, hand-fed temple crocodile of Crocodilopolis, but Sobek in his older, more primordial form, associated with the raw, dangerous power of water and shadow. This fused form, Sobek-Ra, reflects a broader Egyptian religious habit of merging deities together rather than replacing one with another, layering old fears and new authority into a single combined figure, before centuries of temple cult had softened and elevated his image into something closer to royal protection. 6. Shesmu, the god of wine and of the press. In most contexts, Shesmu presided over the ordinary business of pressing grapes and oils for temple offerings. But in underworld texts, Shesmu's press takes on a considerably darker role. The condemned are described as being placed inside it, and what emerges afterward is described flowing the way wine would. Despite this underworld association, Shesmu also appears in far gentler New Kingdom tomb paintings, quietly overseeing the ordinary pressing of grapes for the afterlife's own banquets, a reminder of how the same god could occupy both roles without contradiction. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most disturbing images to survive from Egyptian funerary literature, and it shows up specifically in texts meant to terrify the living into moral behavior, not just to describe the fate of the already dead. 5. The 42 judges of Maat. Before a soul could pass into the afterlife, chapter 125 of the Book of the Dead describes it standing before 42 separate entities, one for each province of Egypt. Each of these 42 provinces or nomes had its own judge, meaning a soul's fate was decided not by one court, but by representatives of the entire nation, assembled in a single hall, each demanding a specific denial of a specific sin. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not caused suffering. This is the so-called negative confession. And getting even one denial wrong in a hall watched by 42 judges whose names alone were designed to unsettle the reader meant your case for the afterlife was already in trouble before the weighing of the heart even began. 4. Babai, a baboon god associated with raw, uncontrolled aggression and virility, invoked in some funerary texts as a devourer of souls, judged unworthy of passing on. Some spells go further, describing Babai as the one whose power forms the mast of the ferry boat that carried souls across the underworld's waters, and image scholars still find startling in its bluntness. A figure standing at the more violent, less bureaucratic edge of the underworld's justice system, in contrast to the orderly procedure of the 42 judges. 3. Nekhen, the ferryman who piloted souls across the underworld's dangerous waterways, a role that sounds almost peaceful until you read what those waters actually contained in Egyptian cosmology. Fire, serpents, and currents that could unmake a soul that lost its way. Some texts suggest Nekhen was deliberately kept half asleep by the other gods, roused only when needed to steer, as though even the gods were wary of his full attention. Nekhen's silence in most depictions makes him one of the more genuinely eerie figures in this entire list. Not a monster, exactly, but not entirely comforting company either. 2. Ammit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. 3 of the most dangerous animals in the Nile Valley fused into a single figure that sat permanently beside the scales in the Hall of Two Truths. Unlike almost every other being in this list, Ammit was never assigned a temple or an active cult of worshippers. She existed only within the judgment scene itself, feared rather than worshipped. When a person's heart was weighed against the feather of Maat, goddess of truth and cosmic order, and found too heavy with wrongdoing, Ammit didn't simply punish the soul. She ate the heart, on the spot. And in a culture that had built an entire civilization's worth of ritual, architecture, and belief around surviving death intact, that outcome meant something considerably worse than dying. It meant total, permanent non-existence. No afterlife, no memory, nothing left behind at all. Every culture has a monster. Egypt had one. They were still fighting every single day. Forever, with no final victory ever promised. Apophis, Apep, to use the older name found in the earliest texts, was imagined as a colossal serpent of pure chaos, lying in wait for the sun god's boat every night as it crossed through the underworld, trying to swallow the sun before it could rise again. But this wasn't a myth Egyptians simply read or listened to. It was a myth they performed on a schedule as an act of national defense. There is a real surviving ritual text known today as the Book of Overthrowing Apep, dating to at least the New Kingdom, that gives priests explicit instructions. Model a wax figure of the serpent. Write its name onto the wax, spit on it, bind it, stab it with a knife, burn it in fire until nothing remains. Some temples even kept a wax effigy of the serpent permanently on hand, ready to be ritually destroyed the moment a priest sensed ill omens in the sky. And then, this is the detail worth sitting with, physically erase the written name of Apophis from the sacred texts wherever it appeared. Because in Egyptian belief, a name inscribed and spoken carried real power, and destroying the name was understood to genuinely weaken the thing it named. That is not a metaphor invented for this video. That is a documented, repeated temple practice carried out by real priests on a real ritual calendar. For centuries, Apophis is one of the only entities in this entire bestiary that Egypt didn't just fear from a safe distance in a story. They tried in ritual again and again to make it stop existing. Which brings us back to the question this whole list has been building toward. Out of 30 entities, judges, guardians, gods, and monsters, some protective, some genuinely hostile, some both, depending on who was asking. Which one would you least want to meet? Alone, in the dark, 3,000 years ago? Tell me in the comments. And if this journey through Egypt's hidden bestiary pulled you in, there's another one waiting for you right here.